It is the Sengoku Jidai. Besieged and surrounded by his enemies, a lord pays a group of men to see his only child to safety. But do they have the skill to ensure her safety? And can they even be trusted? For this is an age of honor and treachery, of blood and valor, of gold and steel. Kind of an odd story on how I was first introduced to the Moorcock Multiverse. The first I ever even heard of Moorcock and his work was when Razorfist did his Enter Elric video. Still, it intrigued me. And since I am fortunate enough as a book lover to have 2 public libraries close to home, I went to each to see if I could find any Moorcock books. As it turned out, there were almost none. No Elric, no Coram, no Jerry Cornelius, but there was Dorian Hawkmoon. In terms of characters, Dorian Hawkmoon is one of Moorcock's oldest creations. Elric is certainly the first, with The Dreaming City being written in 1961, 6 years before the first Hawkmoon story, The Jewel in the Skull. However, the first 4 books in the Hawkmoon cycle, The Jewel in the Skull, The Mad God's Amulet, The Sword of the Dawn, and The Runestaff, were written before Moorcock really began to crystallize the idea of the multiverse and connecting all of his various protagonists together with the theme of the Eternal Champion. It was only in the later 3 Hawkmoon books, Count Brass, the Champion of Garethorm, and the Quest for Tanalorn, that finally tied Hawkmoon firmly into the greater multiverse. Though of course, being one of Moorcock's most popular incarnations of the Eternal Champion, Hawkmoon does cameo in a few other adventures of other champions, again most famously in Sailor on the Seas of Fate. There are a few pretty good print editions of the Hawkmoon stories, although alas no audio adaptations. For example, the first 2 books can be found together as Jewel and Amulet, and the second 2 as Sword and Runestaff. These first 4 also exist in a complete collection known as The History of the Runestaff, while the later 3 books are combined into the omnibus The Chronicles of Castle Brass. Once again, this video is mostly going to be an introduction to the character of Hawkmoon and the world that he inhabits. So spoilers for at least the first part of The Jewel in the Skull. Here I must begin with the world first, rather than the character. Partly because Hawkmoon just isn't as interesting as Elric, Coram, or Erakoze, but also because the world of Hawkmoon is one of the better parts of it. Because for once, there's an actual degree of world building here. In many ways, the world of Hawkmoon reminds me of the world of Conan, which is hardly surprising given Moorcock's open admiration for Robert E. Howard. The difference is, while the Hyborian Age is a primordial, fantastical past version of the world we know, the world of Hawkmoon is a dark, twisted future version of the world we know. The world of the Dark Empire of Gran Bratan. It all begins with nukes, of course. It's post-World War II, so it has to start that way. Following this nuclear holocaust was the tragic millennium, as civilization slowly and painfully began to crawl back towards the light of something resembling development. But something that traumatic doesn't just heal. It leaves its scars upon those that have suffered it, even if the events themselves are generations in the past. And sometimes those scars can leave its victims twisted in ways that it doesn't bear contemplating. The world that finally emerged from the tragic millennium looks familiar, but in many ways is different, all the way down to the maps. Of course, the story itself takes place mostly in this dark future version of Europe. Across the sea there is the great mysterious continent of Amerik, whereas to the east, beyond Persia, Moscovia, and Ukrainia, are the lands of Asia Communista. For the most part, the map of Europe of this bizarre dark future looks like one we would recognize. But for example, Portugal no longer exists, and most of Iberia is under this new name España, though apparently Catalonia is independent as Catalania. Holland now controls Denmark as part of this greater realm called Hollandia. Yugoslavia is still a thing, albeit under the name of Slavia. Austria is called Osterland, and France is no longer unified, having 2 separate states within its territory. Normandia, which includes of course Normandy and Brittany, and Kamarg in the south, which mostly corresponds to this place along the Rhone, which is also called Kamarg, which is basically this coastal delta on the Mediterranean. More on that later. But of course, the dominant power in this dark and terrible age is the Empire of Gran Bratan. Based out of the capital of Londra, by the time the story of Dorian Hawkmoon begins, Gran Bratan controls the British Isles, Scandinavia or Scandia, Hollandia, Hispania, Catalonia, parts of France, all of Normandia, and bits of Germania, as well as having satellite states in bits of Italia and Slavia. This dominance comes from the fact that Gran Bratan has managed to recover some of the old science from the tragic millennium before the bombs changed the world. And so while this is technically a fantasy setting, this sort of thing where after an apocalypse technology is forgotten and the world reverts back to actual magic, see the Shannara Chronicles, Gran Bratan features some elements of science fiction, albeit science fiction so out there it might as well be magic as well. The most noteworthy examples of Gran Bratan's technology being its famous flying machines known as ornithopters and full-on laser weapons referred to as fire lances. It's thanks to this technology that all these conquests controlling most of Western Europe occurred only within 20 years. And the people of the Empire of Gran Bratan had great ambitions. 20 years it had taken to conquer Europe. They were confident that by year 30, they would take Arabia, and by year 50, they would have enough power to conquer Asia Communista itself. This would be a very grim fate indeed, for Gran Bratan is not named the Dark Empire without cause. For all their technological sophistication, the people of Gran Bratan are utterly morally debased, especially the ruling class, who delight in visiting every kind of agony and suffering upon helpless victims simply for entertainment, because apparently it's the only thing that gets them off, both literally and metaphorically. In fact, there are several characters remarking upon Gran Bratan who say that there must be something fundamentally wrong with this particular race of men, that they would take such delight in such vile depravity. The principal dominant force within the government, if you can call it that, of Gran Bratan, are various grim orders, essentially parodies of knightly orders, each one denoted by a sculpted helmet that is made to look like the head of a certain animal. The Order of the Snake, the Order of the Boar, the Vulture, the Wolf, etc. The masks are also an important part of their etiquette, as most Gran Bretanians just don't feel comfortable taking them off, feeling naked without them on. Even the gods the Gran Bretanians worship are particularly unpleasant. Most of them, amusingly enough, are based off of historical figures from the actual 20th century. For example, the terrible gods that ruled before the tragic millennium were Jon, George, Faul, and Runga. Other such deities include Churchill, the howling god, Arel Vilson, the roaring god, Bijran Adas, the singing god, Gigi Blad, the groaning god, and Jlim Slas, the weeping god. Most terrible of all were the gods of doom and chaos, respectively Krediskviz and Balanza Credid. Lower than the gods, but certainly higher than any mortal man, was the Emperor of Gran Bratan, the God King Huan. Guarded by his personal Order of the Mantis, Huan sought more than anything else to achieve immortality, and through the dark techno-sorceries retrieved from the tragic millennium, he did achieve immortality of a sort. Unfortunately, it's the kind of immortality that has him confined all of his life to a giant amniotic tank. By the time the story begins, he is effectively withered into a fetus-like thing with an oversized skull. His arms and legs have atrophied to the point of uselessness, and so the only part of his body that he can use to do things inside his globe is his long, hideously prehensile tongue. Most of the time he uses his tongue to essentially turn on the equivalent of a speaker for his amniotic globe, which of course relates not the dry, husky voice you would expect of a homunculus, because that's pretty much what he is, but the voice of a young man. This marvel being achieved usually by very painfully extracting the vocal cords of a young, healthy man. For the most part, though, Huan seems reasonably content with his lot as the most powerful man in the world, and as long as he can extend his already unnaturally long life, the drawbacks of his situation don't really bother him so much. Clearly, Europe, not to mention the world, was going to need a hero to stand up to this empire of chaotic depravity. Enter Dorian Hawkmoon. Originally the Duke of Köln, today's Cologne, Germany, Hawkmoon was one of the many unfortunates who resisted and was ultimately crushed by the army of Gran Bratan. While he was originally destined to be tortured to death for the amusement of the Gran Britannia nobility, an unexpected opportunity came his way, in the form of Baron Maliadus, Grand Constable of the Order of the Wolf and the most powerful general in the Dark Empire's army. Maliadus sought to use the young duke as a tool of revenge against the great Count Brass of Kamarg. A mercenary and an idealist simultaneously, Count Brass had spent much of his life supporting various causes that he thought was right, so long as he could get paid for it as well. Eventually, he became the Lord Protector of Kamarg after its previous ruler, a cruel man known only as the Bulgar, died. He was much beloved by his people for his strength and his great wisdom. Although that wisdom was not quite absolute, for initially, ignorant of the true evil nature of Gran Bratan, he saw its efforts to unify Europe as a good thing, the triumph of order over the violent chaos that had rocked the continent since time out of mind. Thus, Baron Maliadus had gone to Kamarg to try and persuade Count Brass to ally himself with the Dark Empire. However, though the Count approved of the unification and bringing of order that the Dark Empire did, he wasn't willing to surrender his own sovereignty. And thanks to his winged cavalry of giant flamingos and the powerful towers of Castle Brass powered with technologies and weapons that equaled those of Gran Bratan, there was nothing the Dark Empire could really offer him that might change his mind. The Count was content to rule his small patch of land, and he had the means to defend himself against any aggressor. Thus, Kamarg was rendered safe against any invader. Thus, the Baron could not tempt him either with power or with security. However, despite the insistence of the Count's longtime friend and advisor Bowgentle that Baron Maliadus, like all Gran Britannians, was literally the spawn of evil, Count Brass continued to view Baron Maliadus as a decent and polite man. That all changed when Maliadus attempted to seduce the Count's daughter, Iselda. She had been initially attracted to the man because, after all, girls do like bad boys, particularly when they're young and foolish, but she knew that Count Brass would likely not condone a marriage between her and the Baron, and she was loyal enough to her father that when Maliadus suggested eloping with him, she refused. Outraged at being rejected once again, the Baron attempted to kidnap Iselda and injured Bowgentle when he tried to intervene. This act finally persuaded Count Brass that Baron Maliadus and the empire he served were evil, and he sent the Baron packing. Seething with rage, Baron Maliadus immediately began plotting his revenge on Count Brass, and decided that the recently captured Duke Dorian Hawkmoon of Köln would be the perfect puppet. For Hawkmoon was no longer the brave, arrogant defender of Köln. Not only had he suffered the agony of defeat in watching so many brave men die under his command, but the atrocities that the Dark Empire had inflicted upon Köln had effectively stripped out a part of his emotions and who he once was. How traumatizing is this? Well, they only crucified all of the girl children in Köln, castrated all of the boy children, and then forced their parents to perform every debased, lewd behavior you can think of, and probably a few dozen that you can't. The horrors inflicted upon his people caused something to die inside Dorian Hawkmoon's mind and heart, leaving him numb to the world and numb to morality. Enlisting the help of Baron Kalan of Vital, Grand Constable of the Order of the Snake and the Chief Scientist of the Empire, Baron Maliadus made a deal with Dorian Hawkmoon. Infiltrate Kamarg and Castle Brass and kidnap Iselda to use her as a bargaining chip against Count Brass. In return, he would be restored to Köln as essentially Gran Bratan's puppet. At the very least, he would get his old land back. To make sure that Hawkmoon would keep faith with them, Kalan used a strange bit of techno-sorcery from the Tragic Millennium to implant in the forehead of the former Duke of Kuln a black jewel. With it, the Grand Bretonians could see through it like a third eye, so that they could witness all that Dorian could see. Mind you, they could only see, they could not hear what was said to him. However, they figured this would not be that big of a problem, as they had an insurance policy should Hawkmoon betray them. For the black jewel was a dormant thing, but it was infused with the full malignant energies of the machine that had created it. If the Grand Bretonians ever believed that Hawkmoon was betraying them, they would use the connection with the black jewel to activate it fully, so that the device would then burrow through Hawkmoon's skull and consume his brain. A horrific and agonizing end. They fed him a story to give Count Brass when he arrived in Kamarg that he had narrowly escaped being transported to Londra after the fall of Kuln, and at first the plan seemed to be going successfully. However, Melodius and Kalan had greatly underestimated Count Brass and Bowgentle. Very quickly they realized exactly what was going on, and were able to, for lack of a better term, subdue the jewel in Hawkmoon's skull, thus freeing him from Grand Breton's control. That's not to say that they've gotten rid of it, and at any point, the Grand Bretonians might find some way to reactivate it and kill Hawkmoon. And so, despite coming as an enemy initially, Hawkmoon found succor and friendship at Castle Brass. He also began to fall in love with Count Brass's daughter Iselda, and that love began to reawaken the parts of himself that had been numbed by the massacres and atrocities committed in Kuln. Still, he would never know peace so long as he had a literal death sentence bolted to his forehead. And even beyond that, Grand Bratan would never stop its ceaseless expansion. It would not rest until it controlled all the world. According to Count Brass, there might be one way to save Hawkmoon's life from the jewel in his skull. In the far distant land of Persia, there was a mystic named Malagigi of Hamadan. He had greater knowledge of the Tragic Millennium than any other living man. He might be the only one that could truly destroy the jewel and save Hawkmoon from the death sentence hanging over his head. But Dorian's quest was to be more than for just his own salvation. Though he didn't know it yet, he was an incarnation of the Eternal Champion, and thus it was his duty to restore balance to his world. And the key to fulfilling his destiny lay in a strange, mystical object known as the Runestaff. The legend of the Runestaff was one known all across the world, passed down from father to son for generations. An object of incredible power beyond human conception. The Grand Bretonians had long sought it because they thought that with it in their hands they could complete their conquest of the world. For Dorian, it may be the only key to stopping the Dark Empire from achieving its nefarious goals. No one really knows what exactly the Runestaff looks like, or even the full nature of its power. All that the people know is one thing: never swear an oath upon the Runestaff lightly. For those who dare swear by the Runestaff must then benefit or suffer from the consequences of the fixed pattern of destiny that they have set in motion. As it happens, Baron Melodius, as he was being kicked out of Kamarg by Count Brass, in his anger at being thwarted, made an oath upon the Runestaff that he would see Kamarg destroyed and Count Brass humbled. Thus, without even knowing it, Baron Melodius set in motion a chain of events that would lead to the Eternal Champion, Dorian Hawkmoon, taking the first steps on the road to his destiny. The quest for the Runestaff, and the great cosmic struggle between law and chaos, and the balance that underpins it all.